Let's go to London. Let's bring in H.A. Hellyer, Senior Fellow in Geopolitics, International Security in the Mideast Studies at RUSI and at the Centre too for American Progress in Washington. A friend of the programme, great to have you with us, H.A. First of all, let me get your general assessment, 41 hours into this unprecedented Israeli operation and retaliations, how you read the situation.
Thank you, Gavin. It's always a pleasure to be on your programme. Before I go into that, just one additional point from Noga's excellent report. Of course, the civilian population in Gaza is also going to be very, very concerned about what this escalation means. There'll be far fewer eyes on Gaza now as a result of Israel's opening up a new war with Iran. And of course, the extent of horror in Gaza is such that it becomes unspeakable. So I just wanted to put that on the record there. In terms of the last couple of days, not even 2 days yet, but already I think we've seen an incredibly significant change on a regional level, and it's not a positive one. And I think that there's been a lot of jubilation in different places, imagining that these are, quote unquote, the birth pangs of some sort of new Middle East. On the contrary, this is a spiral. And it's a spiral that sees an environment of impunity that has been very evident for the past couple of years, but this is simply a new manifestation of it, that allows for this sort of vigilante action to take place without consequence. And the only repercussion from that is yet more vigilante action to take place without consequence. We've seen over the past couple of years the results of Israel's war in Gaza, the utter devastation and horror that has been wrought there. We saw further vigilante action in Lebanon, of course, with Syria as well, where the occupation of southern Syria has been widened, and now with Iran. And nobody needs to be a fan of the Iranian regime or Hezbollah, for that matter, or Hamas either, in order to see that this sort of activity is incredibly destabilizing for regional order. It's destabilizing regional security, but it also has massive repercussions for international order and international security as well, because it means that there isn't a rules-based order at all. It becomes the quote-unquote law of the jungle, and that should be quite concerning to all of us.
There are probably two ways to look at the US involvement or not, acknowledgement of events and complicity in support of events. One would be that given the negotiations that were ongoing, now suspended tomorrow, the sixth round of nuclear talks, that this was a way of Benjamin Netanyahu breaking the cycle, taking out, literally assassinating a number of the lead negotiators and kind of calling the hand of President Trump and then patching up later. The second way of looking at this is the kind of a working together, a good cop, bad cop between Trump and Netanyahu. How do you see it?
I think there's actually a third way, and I appreciate why you would put it in such stark terms, because that would be quite normal. But we're not dealing with we're not dealing with very regular actors here, shall we say, in the sense that, for example, you saw signals from DC, particularly from the president, that he thought that actually these attacks would lead to a breakthrough in negotiations. And it would make negotiations even more likely to succeed. I don't know anybody who thinks that, okay? But I don't doubt that he thinks that this is actually a fairly strong possibility. But I don't know anybody else who thinks that. I think that actually, on the contrary, the moment that it became clear on Friday that the United States had not actively intervened to stop Israel from this sort of action, the negotiations would be over. No, that's one. Two, I don't think that the Americans actually colluded with the Israelis in terms of this attack. I think what happened was a little bit more, how should we say, nuanced or even convoluted, in the sense that I think that the White House really did want a deal, was pushing for a deal, did not want Israel to go forward until probably the very last couple of days. And then even then, not advocating that Israel go forward, but coming to the conclusion that if it didn't stand in its way, that it might actually be helpful. in terms of the negotiations. Again, it's an assessment and a calculation that I don't think is shared by many in the national security community, pretty much anywhere. But I don't put it past the realm of possibility that that's the calculation that went ahead.
One thing that strikes me, H.A., is the fact that in the last 24 hours, I've spoken to some former Israeli ambassadors to the US, some others, politicians, Israelis that have been critical of Benjamin Netanyahu over Gaza, who aren't on this issue, who say that even if there is no chance of decapitating the nuclear facilities because they're so deep underground, to put them back 2 years, it prevents a situation where you have a pariah state which is untouchable, a bit like North Korea. What's your take on that?
Well, it's interesting to hear the word pariah state because, again, that phrase has been bandied around within the region for the last couple of years, but it's been used in reference to Israel. It hasn't been used in reference as much over the past couple of years, just over the past couple of years, with regards to Iran. Because, of course, what Israel has done in Gaza is horrific and of a level that I don't think anybody thought could be possible. The attacks on Syria over the past 6 months, where there's been bombing and strikes and further occupation, and an active call from like senior Israeli ministers to quote unquote dismember Syria. Okay, so I mean this sort of language is quite striking. But I'll also say that when it comes to like putting Iran on the back foot, again, nobody should be a fan of the Iranian regime. It's a bad actor. It's been a bad actor with regards to Hezbollah. It's been a bad actor with regards to Yemen. It's been an awful actor, most of all, in Syria, and so on. I mean, there are many places to point to in this regard. But that's not the point here. The point is what is going to be the best way to ensure that a nuclear weapon is not created by the Iranians. Bombing them doesn't do that. Getting a deal does that. Bombing them simply makes sure that they will try 100 times more in order to get a nuclear weapon, because they will assess that there is no rules-based order, there is no regional order, there's simply the threat of force and mutually assured destruction. Okay.
Yeah.
So
yes,
it's not something that I advocate. Obviously, I think this is a terrible idea, but it's not going to lead to where your previous guests, as you've indicated, I think have thought it to be.
To which, when quoting on the pariah state, is probably worth saying that the reference to North Korea as the pariah state rather than Iran. However, you could argue now with North Korea and Russia, less of a pariah state than it was before. To which point, Vladimir Putin saying today in the past hour or so via AFP that he's spoken to President Trump today, a phone call where they've discussed the Israel-Iran issue. That's a very vexed, complex geopolitical landscape we're in now, aren't we? Because we're having Donald Trump, who gave, 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks to President Putin on Ukraine to work out whether he was, quote, being tapped along. Now they're talking between them about how to deal with Israel-Iran. What do you make of that?
Well, again, this is why I keep on coming back to the regional security part of this, but also the international order part of it. There's a human cost, of course, to everything that we're talking about. There have been at least 60, 70, probably many more, tens of thousands of people, 70,000, 80,000, we don't even know, of people who have been killed in Gaza as a result of Israel's war. We can talk about all sorts of, really horrific actions across the region over the past couple of years. Beyond the human cost, in the immediate sense, there is a constant degrading and fragmentation of international law and it underpinning any sorts of rules-based order. And by the way, the Israeli strike on Friday, or indeed Israel's war in Gaza over the last couple of years, or with regards to Syria, they're not the only culprits in this regard. Of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is quite fundamental in understanding that fragmentation and degrading. But all of these things put together simply make it very clear to the vast majority, I think, of the world that if you try to bank on international law being upheld, then you're on your own. You cannot rely on the most powerful nations in the world doing so unless the crime is being done by an enemy against an ally. Otherwise, it's pretty much a talking point. And I don't think that's good news for any of us, because there are crises that are going to come upon us, as there are always crises that come upon us in the years to come, not least of which have to do with the climate crisis. But I'm sure many other conflicts in terms of territory, other sorts of wars that are going to come about. And we need the rules-based order. We need international law in order to at least mitigate how horrific and devastating those conflicts and those wars are going to be. And without rules-based order, without international law, the consequences for all of us, I think, are incredibly dire.
To the point, I think I was listening to Peter Ricketts, the former National Security Advisor in the UK, echoing your point, saying basically that he believes Benjamin Netanyahu right now, as his consideration is that believes President Trump has been too distracted and is too distracted with Ukraine, with LA, with what, and this was a time to move. Can I ask your other thought in the region, and that is of Saudi Arabia, and how would you calculate and work out the Saudi position here? Well, let's face it, probably not losing any sleep over these Israeli strikes, but also an uncomfortable time. Yeah.
But that's an excellent point. So the Saudis, the Emiratis, actually many leaders in the region writ large, they're not fans of the regime in Iran. For very good reasons, they're not fans of the regime in Iran. So it's not that their reactions are rooted in some sort of hidden sympathy for the Iranian regime. On the contrary, they have actually suffered as a result of the Iranian regime, and they are incredibly worried about the destabilizing consequences of that regime going back many, many years. And they have all, absolutely every single leader that I can think of in the region, have all come out very publicly, with the exception of one or two, but they're not expressing support for the Israelis either. But in the GCC, I think every leader has come out and said that they condemn this attack. And they condemn it, again, not because they're sympathetic to the Iranians. Rather, they are concerned that this will simply lead the region into a spiral. And they see the Israelis as engaging not as an actor that is concerned with removing some sort of threat to regional stability, but on the contrary, that they are the largest threat to regional security, because they see this strike not in isolation. They see this strike as the latest example and manifestation of how Israel has engaged in the region over the last couple of years with utter impunity. Again, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and now Iran.
H.A., good to hear your thoughts tonight. Dr H.A. Hellyer, Senior Associate Fellow at RUSI, Royal United Services Institute, and non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Institute for International Peace. Thank you, and have a good evening.